Support for this episode comes from Edge Park. Managing diabetes doesn't need to get in the way of your passion, your social life, or your budget. Edge Park can help you simplify your diabetes journey so you can focus on other important things. Edge Park offers a wide array of continuous glucose monitors, such as the Dexcom G7, Freestyle Libre 3, and more. Plus, Edge Park accepts most insurance plans and handles the paperwork. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Edge Park logo to learn more.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, one of the pioneers of the DIY movement is turning her attention to exercise. Dana Lewis is part of a team of researchers who want to create a tool to help you make better and easier decisions around whatever workout you choose. There's a lot of variability here, big difference between, say, weightlifting and long-distance running. Dana will explain what they're looking at here, the big goals, and we get to catch up about what tech she's using these days to manage her life with T1D, which now includes ultramarathoning. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I am your host, Stacey Sims. I'm always so glad to have you here. You know we educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I've been looking at my calendar because I know this week kicks off a really busy run for me. I'm excited about it. It's all good stuff, so I cannot complain. If you live anywhere near Boston, I hope to see you this weekend at the JDRF Greater New England Type 1 Nation Summit. I am the opening keynote there with Carrie Sparling. We're doing it together. And then I'm doing a breakout session on independence. My son was diagnosed at 2 and he is now 19. I got to tell you, I don't know anything anymore. I don't know what's going on. I don't know how he's doing. I know when he needs supplies. He's really good about that. And he does call me. But oh my gosh, this is the weirdest phase of diabetes yet for me. But it's what we were working for all this time. And I'm going to get to check in with Benny because the first weekend in April, I'm going to Friends for Life Falls Church. That is their regional conference. It's happening in Falls Church, Virginia. Benny goes to school not far from there, so I'm going to stop in and bother him. And then the following weekend, April 12th and 13th, is Mom's Night Out Chicago. I have a promo code for you. Use the promo code MOM20 at registration, and that will save you $20. If you have any questions about Mom's Night Out, we have 2 more events coming in the fall, one in Denver, one in Philadelphia, and we're looking at locations for next year already. Just ping me, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. I am thrilled that these events are taking off the way that they are. This is really a dream come true for me, but I always want to hear from you. Let me know what you think. Let me know how we can make it better. And let me know if you want us to come to your city. If you're new around here, you might not know Dana Lewis, but longtime listeners and longtime diabetes people know her as one of the earliest developers and adapters of DIY, do-it-yourself, diabetes technology. I started this podcast in the summer of 2015, and DIY, We Are Not Waiting, CGM in the Cloud, all of these thoughts and phrases were really taking the diabetes community by storm at that time. So I had Dana on immediately. I knew I wanted her to be one of my first guests. And here's what I wrote when she came on the show for the first time in October of 2015. Worried about alarms she couldn't hear, Dana Lewis and Scott Librand hacked into the programming of her CGM. What they learned led them to a do-it-yourself closed-loop artificial pancreas system that Dana has been using since December of 2014 and which she wore to their wedding in August. We find out how they did it, why they make their methods public, and what it may mean for the future of diabetes management. That was from the episode 9 years ago now. I'm going to link it up along with other past episodes with Dana if you want to take a walk down memory lane or catch up if you are new. She is one of the many pioneering people who developed DIY products and features that are now used in many commercial devices. Today, she is part of a team that is looking to build on the T1D exercise initiative, or T1D. It is the largest observational exercise study in people with type 1. The team that Dana is on is using a grant from the Helmsley Charitable Trust. It involves researchers from Stanford University, from the University College Dublin. Dana is part of a terrific team looking to make exercise with diabetes easier. And we will talk about it right after this. I'm amazed how hard these automated insulin delivery systems work. Omnipod 5 automatically increases, decreases, or pauses insulin delivery every 5 minutes. This technology is called Smart Adjust, and it's in the pod. This means if you're out on the football field and the controller is in your bag, the pod and Dexcom G6 continue to talk and make adjustments. That would have been awesome for us in middle school when Benny played football, or when he was backstage at the school play. All that, and you get the freedom of no tubes. Fill out the quick online form, see if you're eligible for a free trial. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Dana Lewis, welcome back to Diabetes Connections. It is always great to talk to you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Stacey. It's been a while.
Yeah. So let's catch up and talk about what technology are you using? This is always an interesting question for somebody like yourself.
Well, probably not a surprise to people who know me is I'm still using OpenAPS, which is the first open source automated insulin delivery system. I've been using it now for 9, almost 10 years, and it is still the thing that works best for me, and that's what I'm using. So standard insulin pump, standard CGM, but in interoperable algorithm is pulling data from those devices, making decision-making, and taking a lot of the work off of my shoulders every day in diabetes.
With OpenAPS, and I'm always the dummy with the DIY stuff. You may remember that about me. Is it, when you say a standard pump, is this one of these, is it still a pump that's not like a modern smart pump?
Yep,
Okay.
I'm still using an older generation pump. I'm using an up-to-date CGM nowadays. But that's really one of the beautiful things about the open source systems is depending on your pump, depending on your phone, depending on your algorithm preference, you have a lot of choices. And so in my case, I'm still using the older pump, but the algorithm, has evolved over the years and has a lot of flexibility and customization that even with very variable food choices, very variable exercise from sedentary to ultramarathons, it works really, really well for me. And one of the reasons the flexibility is there is because of this concept we have in using net IOB. So this concept of using all changes to insulin delivery, whether that's basal or bolus. And that really helps me when I am going to exercise or look at a day that's maybe less typical for me. I can better understand what the system has been doing and how I, as the human, want to interact with it or not.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, which will lead us, to what we're going to talk about later. Net IOB, how is that different from insulin on board, which I think is what most of us are familiar with?
Yeah, so insulin on board, historically with pumps and closed loop systems, AIDs, look at bolus only IOB. So if you sit down for lunch and you bolus 4 units, you're going to start with 4 units of IOB, and that's going to decay over time. However, let's imagine that you were in the pool for 2 hours and you had a pump that you were disconnected from. Because you had 2 hours without basal insulin delivery, if you're not on a patch pump, your total IOB with net IOB is going to be lower than the 4-unit amount, even when you just bolus for 4 units. It's basically subtracting those 2 hours of basal that you didn't have. And so there's a lot of cases like exercise where people might be disconnected or suspended from their pump, or they've lowered their insulin, where after the exercise, they often have hyperglycemia that they don't understand because they were exercising. Maybe they think they're more sensitive, but oftentimes we need to account for our body was expecting a certain amount of insulin. We did not get that. And so sometimes we have to make up for the missed insulin, but also it influences at the point of food, our body doesn't have as much circulating insulin activity from that basal insulin delivery. And so what our liver does with food changes depending on whether or not we have insulin activity kind of in our body as a residual thing. And we have less of that, more of those carbs are going to go into our bloodstream. So that's oftentimes why we see bigger spikes after you've been suspended, after you've been reduced for exercise and things like that. It's partially a little bit of missing insulin sometimes, but it's also our body is just not primed and ready the same way as if we had some insulin floating in our body. So those are kind of some of the ways that having this concept of net IOB can be helpful is when we've had a reduction in insulin activity. The other time it's helpful is say you have an AID system, you've been running a little bit high going into lunch, and it has been pushing extra insulin to help you stay in good glucose range. Well, at a certain point, if your body switches from resistant to no longer resistant, you're going to have this excess insulin activity that you should know your system has been delivering and how much that is on top of your 4-unit meal bolus. Because if you start dropping unexpectedly after you eat, that helps you in the system figure out, can I reduce insulin or do I need carbs? And again, looking at exercise, if you go into that, sometimes there's an amount of insulin in your body, you can't take it out. You're going to need carbs before exercise. But at other times, you can simply reduce or have the system reduce insulin and not need carbs before or during exercise. So it basically adds another flexible option and gives us more tools to help change glucose outcomes eventually. And often related to exercise, this is really helpful for reducing the amount of carbs that are needed.
Is that concept only in open APS? Is it only in the DIY systems? Is it something that any commercial pumps offer? Are they all
So
like, okay.
it started in open source. So Open APS has it, Loop, Android APS, all the open source DIY variants have this. So this concept has been around for 10 years. And a lot of people use Loop or Android APS and don't even realize like what it is. And they just understand, oh, this includes basal and bolus adjustments. Most of the commercial AID systems do not include this. So when you look at IOB, it's looking at bolus IOB. And you don't always have a sense of if the system's been dosing you more insulin, you might can see it on the graph, but you don't know exactly how much it's been dosing more. Some of the modern systems, my understanding is they are sometimes using it in their predictions. Whether or not it's clearly presented to the user, like if you look at the bolus calculator, whatever, to see what the IOB is, it's not always clear to the user. But I think some systems are starting to head in that direction. And I think that's beneficial. You know, I have literally been using Net IOB for over 10 years, like for a year before OpenAPS. I was using it because it was so powerful to understand that I could increase or decrease insulin compared to my normal basal rate and be able to use that as kind of like stepping off the gas pedal of insulin and still having that pressure effect on my glucose. So that instead of always having to carb, I could step off the gas pedal, reduce insulin a little bit, not have to go all the way to zero, or I could, and have that lessen the effect on my glucose so I didn't have to carb as much. So it can be really, really powerful just on a daily basis. But it's also even more powerful when you're looking at what do we need to do related to situations like exercise or sickness or other times where your system is giving you a lot more or a lot less to adjust for those situations.
Yeah. I mean, looking at, and my personal experience is with my son, right? I don't have any type of diabetes. And the trickiest times were always around exercise, whether it was swimming, like you said, especially, little kids, they swim with their whole bodies, like you're low all the time. And then sports was always such a difficult thing to manage. So I was really excited to read about this development of, a more personalized decision tool. I don't claim to really, even with your wonderful explanation, to totally understand net insulin. I'm one of the people who would really like it, see it running in the background and not have to, look at it and wonder if it's there. But can you talk a little bit before we talk about the tool? You've already mentioned a little bit about your exercise. What are you doing these days, right? I mean, you really have taken off in a direction that you were not in when I think I last talked to you.
Yeah, I was an occasional runner, I think, when we last
Right,
talked.
yeah.
And then in the last couple of years, I went from, running 100 miles a year to like 1,000 miles a year.
Yeah. Tell me
And
about that.
I got into ultramarathon running. I'm a very slow runner, but I love this idea of setting goals and having a schedule and training myself up for it. And the great thing about ultra running as a sport is the community, like the diabetes community, is very, very supportive. It's very much come as you are. It does not matter how slow you are. It's really about you're setting a goal for a distance. It's hard whether you're slow or you're fast, like front of the pack, back of the pack, it does not matter. And also, I just learned that you could just decide to go run an ultramarathon. You don't even have to do it in a race setting. So oftentimes I've been just saying like, hey, I'm going to train towards a 50K or 100 miles. I'm going to do it on X date. And I have access to this really great trail system in the Seattle area. And I could say, I just want to go do that on this date. Scott, my husband, becomes my crew. Like I give him all my snacks all packed and he brings out ice and water and my snacks and refills my pack and sends me on my way for another 4 hours. It's been really great. It's something that I like to do. I don't expect everybody to like to do it, but it's just reminded me how much joy it is when you find an activity that you love, whether it's golf or tennis or, running or cross-country skiing, and then also being able to do it in a way where it's about that activity and diabetes isn't the primary story in that activity. And that's one of my favorite things is even when I went from very little activity to 8 hours of running or 25 hours of running in one go or 4 days of running in a row, having systems that can be flexible and automatically respond to what I'm doing, where I don't have to do I am this sensitive, I am eating X amount of food over time, and I'm exercising, and I'm going to keep exercising for 4 hours. It's way less work than it used to be with manual diabetes. And probably I wouldn't be doing all of this without having an automated system that really allows for that, that mental energy being freed back up so I can focus on just continuing to move my body for 8 hours or whatever period of time it is.
If we have time, I want to come back around. I have some more questions for you about all this running, but I'm sure you get them all the time. But we're here really to talk about the Helmsley grant for this development of a personalized decision support tool. Tell me a little bit about this. What's the goal? What are you hoping to do here?
Well, Helmsley put out this RFP and said, we want to focus on preventing hypoglycemia related to exercise. And I went, oh, I've been wanting to do a study looking at net IOB and the relationship with exercise, because with a lot of these great data sets, like the one that Helmsley has created, it's called the T1D, the Diabetes Exercise Initiative data set. They've got this great exercise data. They have people who've used AID systems. They've used people with MDI, standalone pumps, so non-AID. This really great data set and all this exercise data, which you normally don't see with the diabetes data set. And so you can really look at the relationship of things like food intake, insulin activity, everything else. And one of the first seminal papers by Mike Riddell and his team, they actually had just a sentence in there about how the amount of insulin on board sometimes corresponds with hypoglycemia. And he went, okay, but is that level the same or different when you have an AID system, again, adjusting insulin delivery above and below your normal? And so my pitch for this project was, I want to reclassify the insulin data with net IOB. So instead of bolus only IOB, we're going to have all of the basal modulations of the AID system for AID users and look at, are there different strategies that we can use with an AID system, because we're looking at the net of all insulin adjustments, and have some other options, different timing, different strategies to then adjust hypoglycemia related to exercise. Because another thing that we've been studying is looking at patterns of hypoglycemia. Even if you have a closed loop AID system, we've observed in some of the data sets that there are basically kind of a perturbation in pattern up to 48 hours. So you have one instance of hypoglycemia, you are more likely to have another hypoglycemia within 48 hours. And that kind of comes down over time within 2 days. But then that's meaningful because it's possible that that knowledge could be used to change AID systems so that when hypoglycemia occurs, sensitivity is adjusted to mitigate hypoglycemia, and that scales down over 2 days. And obviously we know exercise and hypoglycemia are correlated. So can we bring all these things together to say we have different strategies for the human to deal with exercise? We can possibly also then propose that there's an adjustment related to hypoglycemia and exercise. If we know that the exercise mode, that higher target is set, maybe that does something not only during the period of exercise, but for 48 hours after. So what we're really doing is looking at this data set of commercial AID users, which I've never looked at before, have great community data from people using DIY open source systems. And we've looked at this kind of thing, but now we're looking and saying, do these patterns exist for commercial AID users? Yes, so far. And then could we come up with a tool that takes all of this knowledge and takes all of these patterns and then presents it to a user and says, okay, you've decided to go exercise in 5 minutes. What are your choices and what are the outcomes going to be? So you can decide, I really want to eat some Skittles. I don't mind eating 20 carbs. Great, eat 20 carbs worth of Skittles, go exercise, enjoy it. But if you're like, I really don't want to eat something, then it might tell you, hey, look, if you set your target and wait for 30 minutes, you may not need carbs, right? Or maybe you need 3 carbs instead of 30 carbs. So depending on the user's preference, the timing flexibility that they have, their interest in doing carbs or not on any given day, the user might choose different choices and they can better understand what's likely to happen. So instead of going out with empty pockets, you might say, okay, I'm going to choose not to carb, but there's a chance I might need 10 carbs, in 30 minutes to an hour. I might want to extend my run because the weather is great today. I'm going to shove some carbs in my pocket just to make sure, I've got those if I end up needing them. So it's really about taking what have we learned about the data for AID, non-AID. There's a great machine learning modeling team at Stanford that's also working with us on this project and looking at how do we present these kind of options to users in an understandable way. So theoretically, at a glance, you could glance at this tool, it has your data and it says, here's what's likely to happen. You pick an intervention, it kind of shows you and you're like, yep, that's what I want. And you go about your business. So instead of just saying, okay, here's my glucose, I don't know what it's predicted to happen, because right now the commercial AIDs don't show you predictions. So in the absence of any predictions of what's going to happen, this is kind of filling in the gap and saying, here's some predictions and helping you understand how your behaviors along with the system can impact the outcomes.
Most of the commercial AID systems they call it different things, but have an activity or exercise mode. Is that showing in the data? Is that something you're taking in mind for this? Right back to our conversation. But first, Diabetes Connections is sponsored by Gvoke HypoPen. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use rescue pen for treating very low blood sugar in people with diabetes ages 2 and above. If you take insulin or sulfonylureas, you're at risk for your blood sugar going too low. Low blood sugar emergencies can happen unexpectedly, and they demand quick action. You need a safety net when it matters most. Be ready to treat very low blood sugar with Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more. Go to gvokeglucagon.com/Stacey. That's gvokeglucagon.com/STACEY. Gvoke shouldn't be used if you have a tumor in the gland on top of your kidneys called pheochromocytoma, or if you have a tumor in your pancreas called insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk for safety information.
So that's something that we'll be basically training on, is looking at when do users set those. An exercise mode is basically a higher target, and sometimes it is just a target. And in some systems, it actually changes the underlying profile settings, like the ISF, the basal rate, things like that. It's like a prefix amount. So yeah, we're going to look at that in the training data and say, how does that change the outcomes?
Right.
And then also look at, depending on the system and the options, there might be different recommendations, right? For some early AID systems, there's one target that you can choose, right? It's either X or Y. Other systems have a range that you can choose between X and Y. And so really looking at what people have chosen in the past, what those outcomes are, and then being able to say, okay, you're using, system A, these are your options, right? In terms of targets, manually changing your insulin, carbing, right? Recognizing that each system might have a little bit different of those recommendations. And so that's what we're eventually going to figure out, is based on what pumps and AID systems are available at the time when we get to this, and then what makes sense to recommend to people, both in a what is worth doing as a human with diabetes. Like, I don't want you to tell me that I need one carb. Like, that's not worth it, right? But figuring out what makes sense to present to a user and show them and help them learn over time. Okay, you did X, this Y outcome. Do you want to do that same thing next time? Do you want to try something different? Because it's showing you a different option. I know historically for me, change is hard as a person with diabetes, especially from early, like 20 years ago. You learned something that worked for you. And then sometimes your body changes, but you still do the thing that worked for you, that you figured out worked for you, because it's kind of hard to understand something changed. This is a permanent change. Maybe I need to shift my strategy or shift what I'm doing. And I think with exercise too, different types of exercise, the timing of exercise related to your last meal, related to the amount of insulin delivery the system has been giving you. There's a bunch of reasons why doing the same thing every time sometimes still gives you different results, right? Like, that's so true of diabetes. And so I'm really excited to see how can we present information to people in a way that really supports their flexibility and helping them with their choices. And, again, taking more of that mental burden and some of that work concept like out of it, so that maybe more people will choose exercise, will choose longer, different exercise, feel safer, feel more confident, feel happier about, going to do these things and making it feel like it's not as hard as it used to be, because it can be hard.
I do love what you said about the practical advice, because telling somebody, right, eat one Skittle. I mean, but having somebody with type 1 who's doing these things makes such a difference.
We are actually seeing in this project in particular, the beautiful thing of having people with diabetes with lived experience, as well as professional experience, and then people with professional experience that don't have diabetes working together, because we people with diabetes deeply understand the real world situation. And so sometimes we're looking at these data sets and some things are very clearly defined. There's a data dictionary for the data set and it makes sense. And other times we're basically recreating history. We are sleuthing and reverse engineering what happened. And so understanding diabetes and understanding what people with diabetes often does as a person with diabetes, you can say, oh, I think this is what's happening here. And so there's actually a case where there's gaps in the records because of how the pump records things, right? The pump was suspended, or somebody set a manual temporary basal rate, for whatever reason. And so there's a timestamp with that event. And then there's a gap. It could be 42 minutes. It could be an hour and 7 minutes. It could be 3 hours and 41 minutes. And people without diabetes are looking at that and they're going, oh my gosh, we're missing all this data. And the person with diabetes goes, no, somebody suspended their pump for 3 hours and 43 minutes. That is something that people do if like they're getting in the pool or for whatever reason. Like, there's a bunch of just real world behavioral stuff that we understand that happens that we can translate back and help better define this data set, so that other researchers in the future who don't have diabetes, they have a learning curve to understand diabetes. And so we're kind of helping bridge that educational gap. And one of the things that I love about this project is it's empowering us to help bring more people into diabetes research who would not be researching in diabetes anyways. And I think that's one of my favorite things, is I love working with people without diabetes experience who get excited and hooked on this and then want to do other projects. And actually some of our collaborators on this project from the University of College Dublin, Arslan Shahid, worked with me on the Open project. And then I looped him and his team of data scientists into this project, and we're working on this. And then there's new people who've joined, and I'm hopefully going to hook them on diabetes and keep them in diabetes research moving forward, which is great because we have more people who understand the need to improve things with diabetes. They understand the data set. So the next project, right, that learning curve is already addressed and we can do even more faster.
That's great. You've talked about this tool a few times. Can you share, or is there a vision for what this tool might look like? Is it an app? Is it built into pumps? Where could it go? How would a user look and interact with it?
It'll probably be a web tool to start, just a prototype. It could eventually be a phone app. My vision is figuring out a way that this works for people with AID and non-AID. Eventually, I'd love for that to include people on MDI as well, because that's always going to be an option. So this is the type of the tool we're going to make everything we do open source. Our processing scripts, our analysis scripts, the tool itself, it's going to be open source. And so we're saying, hey, commercial manufacturers, if you love it and you want to bake it in on your pump, or you want to bake it in your app and your platform, great. But because we are not with one company or any company, right? We're going to make this open source tool. We're going to try to make it as usable as possible by as many people with diabetes as possible, depending on, technology, the data streams, everything. We're going to do as much as we can to make it broadly available. But we'll probably start with a web prototype tool for the study at the end of the grant, with the expectation that depending on what it requires, like under the hood, technologically wise, like how much of that machine learning needs to be on a computer versus an app, that might influence where then after the grant that it goes in terms of, could it be partially put on an app or completely put on apps? What does that look like? But again, it's meant to be supportive as many people as possible, not just one particular type of technology, hopefully, or one system. So we expect the insights to help everybody. And then if that got operationalized into a company taking and running with it, like they've taken some of our open source stuff before, that's great. That would be a fantastic outcome.
Do you need any community support? It sounds like you have all the data that you need. Is there anything that you need from the diabetes community?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So we have, for this project, this T1D data set that Helmsley has made available to us, which is fantastic. And in my other work outside of this grant, I also have access to a community donated data set from people using DIY open source AID. So for people who've donated in the past to these research projects or this data set, thank you, because that has powered this work and that's what's making it possible. I would just say that if you have an opportunity to donate your data set to a data commons like the OpenAPS data commons, if you're a Loop, Android APS, OpenAPS user, please do, because it makes projects like this possible. But also if you have the opportunity to donate your data or be a part of a research study that creates a data set like this, please consider participating. It won't directly help our project at this point in time, but we're coming up with new ways through this work to say we can actually pair these data sets together. And that's one of the things that we have come up with a method to check and deduplicate. So we have an anonymous community data set. We have people who are in these other data sets. We can basically cross-check without compromising your anonymous user IDs, like user 1 over here, user A over there, user X over there. Those could be the same person or they could be a different person. Like, we don't know. It's an anonymous data set, but we've come up with a way to check all of the glucose data, all the timestamps, look for overlap and find if there is the same person, and then just pick which data set do they live in. But then we bring all those data sets together and we have an even bigger data set to both train and test machine learning ideas on, for example, or use in all of our analysis. And that's really great. So the more data, the more things that we can eventually do, especially when it's insulin and glucose data together. So I would just say, we don't have any specific action items for the community right now, but just encourage you to keep an open mind. If you have an opportunity to share data or participate in a research study and it's not too burdensome for you, consider doing it, because especially with these data sets, they are getting shared across teams now, such as the DEXI data set is now shared across these big group of research teams. And it's really powering a lot of cool research that I think is going to reach people with diabetes sooner than, past research studies where it took a long time for innovation to get in the hands of people. That data to innovation to solutions that is accessible to us, that timeline's a lot more efficient now, which is really exciting.
I started this podcast now almost 9 years ago. And that was the time, like you said, you've been doing this for more than 10 years. It was a really interesting and exciting time in the community when there were DIY offerings that were unheard of in the commercial space. There are still a lot of DIY offerings that are not in the space, but they're a lot closer than they used to be. Much was written last summer about a talk that you participated in at ADA, which was basically like, do we need DIY anymore? So I will link that up so people can read about that. I think we do. Where do you see your place in this and for the next 10 years, right? Do you hope to keep pushing the commercial system? Do you think there will always be two tracks here? Or do you think the advances will kind of meld together at some point?
I will say that 10 years ago, I would have never predicted that 10 years later, I would still be sitting here using OpenAPS. Again, we didn't set out to create a thing that, replaced commercial innovation. There was nothing. We built something that worked for us and wanted to share it for other people. Other things came out and some people switched over, some people didn't. Along the way, people have used one, switch to the other, back and forth. Like there's been just a surplus of options for people with diabetes, which I think is fantastic, whether that happens to be commercial or open source solutions. Do what works for you. That's awesome. And so I love that there are choices now. And so for me, while I can't predict the next 10 years, we continue to have a suite of features and functionality in the open source community that do not exist in commercial systems. So we're still seeing some people choose open source and DIY systems for a variety of reasons: cost, access, insurance coverage, things like the ability to not bolus and still get the same, ideal time and range that they want to get, with the trade-off of, do they announce just a general meal size? Do they precisely carb count? Do they partial bolus? Do they fully bolus? Do they do absolutely nothing? Right? Depending on what works for you, your lifestyle, the food that you're eating, the exercise that you're doing, there's just a lot of flexibility and customization kind of on a moment-to-moment basis that I don't see there quite yet in all of the commercial systems. I think some of the upcoming of the next generation are going to get closer to this, but then whether they have all of the functionality in terms of remote data viewing on the platform of your choice and the flexibility to get all of your data, such as predictions, those still not out in commercial offerings yet. So I think there will still be people who continue to explore because they're solving problems that work for them and developing things that also other people like. And that may or may not be reason for people to choose or switch or whatever. So I think they've always been complementary. I think they're continuing to be complementary for several years in the future. Could be completely wrong. In 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, it might look drastically different. But at the end of the day, if people's needs are completely met by solutions from commercial manufacturers, and we have access to our data the way we want it, where we want it, how we want it, I would love my free energy back to go work on other problems in the world that need fixing, right? Like this was never that all of my work has been done open source or now through research projects like this. There's no commercial, was not my day job, is not my day job in that sense. And I would love to put my mind to other things. Just like it's been nice to free up my personal brain from my personal diabetes management. It'd be nice to help other parts of the world outside of diabetes that could use a lot of love and time and energy. So it'd be cool to get to that point, right? It's not about like we want commercial not to be there. We want commercial to be there. We want commercial to do all these things. And sometimes we achieve change by pushing them to change. And sometimes we take a step forward and say, we're leading you there. Please follow. And then they follow at various speeds. Sometimes they leap up and catch up, which is great. I think the future is exciting. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a yes and. I think they're complementary. I think people with diabetes will continue to innovate because we deeply understand what it's like to live with diabetes. And whether those solutions scale up through open source or scale up through commercial offerings, as long as they scale and reach people where they are and where their needs are, I think that's fantastic.
And before I let you go, to come back to the ultramarathoning, any advice? Somebody listening who's like, well, I just ran a 5K. This sounds intriguing. How do I ramp up? Or I could never, right? Any advice?
Well, you need to want to.
Yeah.
I would never say do it if you don't want to. It's kind of like a lot of people kind of go from a 10K half marathon to setting their goals on a marathon, which is a really great step. What most people don't realize is kind of the first ultramarathon distance. Traditionally, it's anything over a marathon. So you could run a 1/10 of a mile more than a marathon. Technically, that's an ultra. Usually, the first ultramarathon distance is what we call a 50K, which is about 31 miles. Woo. So it's about 5 miles more than a marathon. And in ultramarathons, you go a little bit slower. You can still do road type ultramarathons. You can do trail ultramarathons, but you go a little bit slower. You eat more fun snacks that you can digest because you're going slower. And so you get the best snacks that you get to carry in your pack, and you get to go out and explore nature and explore some wonderful weather, some less great weather, but you get to really test yourself and explore the world and spend time outside and eat great snacks and go slow and have fun doing it. So I think for people who are curious, never say never, because I said never again to another marathon. And then I ran another marathon and I was like, well, if I've trained for a marathon, I'll train for 50K in the same year because it's just 5 more miles. And I did that. And then I kind of hooked myself because I realized to me that was fun. It was fun because I'm a slow runner. I can't compete with other people on speed because I'm so slow. I celebrate not like your places from first, like, oh, I'm 4th, I was close to the podium, or I was 10th, I was in the top 10. I celebrate places from last. I mean, if I'm not last, I'm winning. I was like, wow, I was 3 away from the last person. Like, that's great for me. It's really not about speed. It's really about the experience. And kind of through that, some people still love to compete. That's great if that works for you. But if you're not competitive and you feel like you're not fast, you can let go all of that and just say, I want to see what I can accomplish. I want to see if I can cover 31 miles in one go without, stopping for a long time. You could take breaks.
Wow. Yeah.
You can go to the bathroom. You can eat snacks. You can sit down and have a break and change your shoes if you need to. you can really do it however you want. And so it's that flexibility really appeals to me. And if that's a way that gets people into running, and it doesn't have to be run nonstop. I run for 30 seconds and walk for a minute. Run for 30 seconds, walk for a minute. I have an app that just does this gentle chime, and I run and then I walk, and I'm listening to podcasts, I'm listening to books, or I'm talking on the phone, or I'm just out enjoying nature. I don't know. It really, really, really appeals to me. And if it appeals to somebody else, great. I've got a ton of blog posts written about my experience ultramarathoning. I have graphs of everything I ate.
Of course you do.
Every macronutrient, every gram of carb, fat, protein. I have the number of pills that I swallowed in this period because I also have exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. And so now every time I eat a snack when I'm running, I also take an enzyme pill so that I can digest what I'm eating. So I'm dealing with blood sugars and carbs, but I'm also dealing with titrating not only the insulin, but the amount of fat and protein I'm eating to take the enzymes. Because I had the data recorded, I've graphed it. So if you want to see what somebody's blood sugar does with a slow, well-fueled ultramarathon, I've got these graphs up on my site, but a lot of tips for just generally getting started with ultramarathons or thinking about running an ultramarathon, and some of the things that are involved with diabetes and like different strategies with temp targets or changing your basal or what to do with an AID system. But if anybody has questions, reach out to me anytime. I'd be happy to chat one-to-one as well.
I love it. I love it. I'm so glad you're on our team. This is fantastic. Dana Lewis, thank you so much for joining me, and keep us posted on this project. It's really interesting. It's going to help a lot of people. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I'll link up more information. There's not a lot available yet about this particular study, but you can learn more about T1D and the other projects that the Helmsley Charitable Trust is helping research. They had a very big grant recently. I talked about this in the news to help people with diabetes safely incorporate exercise into their daily lives. Dana's project is one of 7, and hopefully I can report on some of the other ones as they go forward as well. But I'll link that up so you can read about it. Other ones include some familiar names around here, Tide Pool, Diabetes Wise, really interesting stuff. Everything from these tools to even, diet. There's a look at menstruation. It's really looks to be very wide-reaching, a big variety here, and boy, so much help. Because as I mentioned to Dana, we're not alone, right? But Benny exercise, holy cow. I'm not embarrassed to tell you. I mentioned that he wrestled in high school, which at the beginning was just a nightmare, but he played basketball when he was, 5th or 6th grade. I encouraged him, do whatever you want, kid. I was crossing my fingers, please quit basketball. And I know many of you have kids, or you yourself did basketball very well. Rob Howe is a friend of mine. I know you can do basketball very well. He played it professionally. But that kid would just tank every game. He would go low, low, low. And then he would go high later. And I was so relieved when he stopped playing basketball. Isn't that terrible? And so I'm so excited to see more help on the way, because there are some incredibly involved people like Dana who want to, really adjust her pump. And as she said, see everything in front of her and know all the science behind it. And there are dummies like me. I won't put Benny in that category, but like me, who just want the stuff to run in the background so my kid can live their life. And I don't have to do any math. All right, that's it for this week. Before I go, please make sure that you register for Mom's Night Out Chicago. Use promo code MOM20 and you will save $20 off registration. Please spread the word if you've got friends in that area. I would love to hear from you if you have any feedback. Thanks as always to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.
The all-new Dexcom G7 continuous glucose monitoring system is now available. Powerful and simple, Dexcom G7 is proven to lower A1C and help you spend time in range, all without finger sticks, scanning, or calibrations. There are so many amazing new features to talk about, I'm never sure where to begin. Dexcom G7 is 60% smaller than the previous generation and is the most accurate CGM system out there. The 30-minute warm-up period is fantastic and up to 2 times faster than any other CGM brand. And I love the all-in-one sensor and transmitter. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo.